Carrie, I'm so excited to learn about time mastery for SLPs from you today. We're going to talk about how to revolutionize scheduling and service delivery. And I know this is so needed, especially amongst school based SLPs.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Super excited. So this is available for ASHA CEUs or point one ASHA CEUs. So our learning outcomes today, we hope by the end of this pod course, you'll be able to describe 2 ways to change your mindset to streamline and save time. Identify 2 strategies to modify scheduling and service delivery to save time for faster client progress. List 3 strategies to streamline data collection techniques and describe 2 methods for reducing planning time. That all sounds really good to me, but it also seems like a little bit of magic has to happen here. So can't wait to hear what you have to share. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with some introductions and backgrounds. Then we'll talk about how to streamline and save time by changing your mindset, how to modify your schedule and service delivery model to save time, how to streamline data collection techniques, and then we'll get into methods for reducing planning time. And then we'll wrap up with our references and closing remarks. Carrie, can you come on and share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I'm a speech language pathologist. I live here in Columbia, Missouri, which is right smack dab in the middle of the USA. I have worked with pretty much all ages of children and teenagers, babies, all the way up. And I've worked in schools, I've worked in preschool, special education centers, private practices. I had my own private practice. So I've kind of done a little bit of everything. Several years back, I started blogging on my website about just what I was doing in my therapy room. And what I found was that what people really appreciate from my resources is my ability to look at the research and then put that together in kind of a step-by-step plan of like, how do we actually make this happen? So that is what I do now is I help other speech language professionals and parents and caregivers and educators figure out how to support children with communication challenges by kind of using those step-by-step plans.
Amazing. Well, we're super excited to have you on. And my name is Vanita Litvak. You've probably been listening to the podcast, hopefully for a while now, or maybe Carrie referred you. So this is your first time and we're just meeting. But I have a passion for using AAC and literacy to support individuals with complex communication needs. I've had the opportunity to present at local and national conferences and co author the Lou Knows What to Do book series. And earlier last year, I became an NLA trained clinician to more effectively support Gestalt language processors. And when I'm not podcasting or doing speechy things, I have recently taken up tennis lessons, making specialty lattes at home so that I can save some money, and then creating cricket designs for friends and family.
I love it.
Do you do any of those? Play tennis, do
I
cricketing?
don't. No, I don't. But I'm a big fan of crochet. So I've always got a yarn project going on.
Amazing. I feel like that's really intimidating.
Once you get into it, like there's this monotony to it that's very soothing.
I hear that. Like it's very zen while you're
Yeah.
in doing it and in the zone. How long does it take? Does it take like any
Yeah.
amount of time you put into it?
Yeah, I mean it takes a while to do anything of decent size. It's more like the act that I get into than like really worrying about what I'm making.
Yeah, that's cool. Maybe I'll have to take that up too. So let's share our financial disclosures. I can go first. I have ownership interest in Speechy Side Up LLC and Tassel Learning LLC. I'm also an affiliate for Simple Practice and Meaningful Speech, and I receive commission for any sales made with my code. I'm also a member of ASHA. How about you, Carrie?
So I'm also a member of ASHA, and then I have the ownership of Speech and Language Kids is my company, and then we're working on setting up our affiliate for you for this course.
Amazing. That's right. All right. So let's dive right in. Let's talk about how SLPs can change their mindset to basically have better sessions, right? And see better
Yeah.
progress.
Yeah. So here's the thing is I feel like almost every speech language pathologist out there has some sort of superhero syndrome where we feel like we need to go above and beyond for every single child that we are serving. And if we are not giving 110% to each and every child in each and every session, we feel like we're failing. And I think this comes from the fact that the people that are attracted to our field are caregivers, right? We all want to take care of these tiny humans that are in front of us that just need this help that we have and we can give. And so we want to pour our hearts into this. And it's such a good and beautiful thing. But when you have a caseload of 50, 60, 70, more than that kids, it's not possible to dedicate the amount of resources to each and every one of them that you would dedicate to just a single kid that we were working with one-on-one, right? And so I think instead of thinking about this as a failing of, oh man, I don't have enough time, I can't help all of the kids that are on my caseload as much as I want, we need to shift our mindset to how can I have the biggest impact? And I think the best way to think about this is, what is it that only I can do, right? So I am with that child however many minutes a week or a month, but I'm not with them the majority of the time. The other people that are with them are their caregivers, their teachers, the educators, the grandparents, the peers. There's all these other people who are on the team, right? We talk about a team approach. But when we think about, okay, what is the piece of it that only I can do because I have this background as a speech language pathologist, that I have this training and experience, and we focus on those things, then we can lean on our teammates to do the rest of it, right? So where does your maximum impact lie? If you're working with a child who has a lot of special needs and they have a reading specialist on the team, then our biggest impact doesn't lie in teaching that child reading. Our biggest impact probably lies in teaching the underlying oral language skills that are impacting their reading. So we can start to look for these little changes in what we're doing that are focusing on what we can do and then letting everybody else focus on what they do best as well. So one way that I like to think about this is with Pareto's principle, which says that 20 or 80% of your outcome comes from 20% of your input. So I don't know actually where that started, what Pareto was actually talking about, but there's been a lot of studies that talk about this aspect of you know, you're getting all of these results, right? And most of those results are coming from a very small percentage of what you're actually doing. And so if we can look at that in terms of what we are doing as speech language pathologists, then we can say, okay, what is the 20% of what I'm doing with my time that's giving my clients 80% of the benefits? And if we can focus in on that, well, then we've just reduced our workload from 100% to 20%, right? So then we can add in the extra pieces that we need beyond that. But we really have to focus on what's that 20% that is going to allow us to work smarter, not harder, which is probably a phrase that everybody's heard too. But how can we implement targeted strategies that are going to make what we're doing more efficient and more effective in less time and less workload for us? Because we don't have to go 110% for every child in order to help them be their best self. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. And I'm sure you're going to tell us what that 20% is, right? As we
Yes.
move along. Okay. I feel like everyone's eagerly like, okay, now what do I need to do so that I don't have to work a whole 100%? Because that
Yes.
sounds really great. And are we talking about school-based settings, private practice settings, or does it apply to everything?
I like to talk about it in the frame of school-based setting because I feel like that's where that biggest workload stress is right now. But the principles and the ideas I'm going to talk about can be used in private practice or a clinic or any other setting as well, with some mild tweaks, you know. But I like to talk about it from the school perspective, because if we can help the school SLPs, then we can help anybody, right? Because they're the ones that are in that hardest position of getting those really high caseloads and not having enough resources.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate it. I would say that most of the listeners of this podcast are school-based SLPs. So I think this is going to be very applicable to the listeners. And then, like you said, if anybody is in private practice, then they can kind of tweak it for themselves as well.
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so let's move on. So,
Okay.
how can SLPs modify their schedules and their service delivery model, especially in the school-based settings, to accommodate for this?
Yeah. So what I want everybody to kind of take away from this is not a one size fits all. This is not a strict regiment that you are going through. I want you to think of this as possible ways that you can find your 20% and hone in on that and streamline what you're doing. This kind of stuff I teach in a 6-week course. So we're consolidating 6 weeks down to 1 hour. So this is going to touch on a lot of these different ideas, but know that if one of these resonates with you, if it sounds like, oh, wow, no, you're right, that could really help me, then that's an area you can look into more. So we're not going to dive super deep into all of them, but we're going to kind of touch on a lot. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So the 3 scheduling and service delivery changes that I want you to think about are 5-minute therapy sessions, the 3-to-1 model, and then this direct versus indirect service minutes idea. So I think if you go to the next slide, I've got some 5-minute stuff that we'll dig into.
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay. So 5-minute therapy sessions. Now, there's nothing magical about 5 minutes, but this is the time there are several research studies that have been done on specifically on 5 minutes. And it's a nice, easy to grab kind of number. So the idea behind 5-minute therapy sessions is that instead of seeing your 4 kids in a group for 30 minutes, you see each one of them individually, one-on-one, for 5 minutes. And you do this multiple times per week. The goal of those 5 minutes is just to get in as many repetitions as possible on that skill. So this obviously lends itself better to a skill that can be used as drill and practice, right? So our speech sounds work really well for this. Grammar works really well for this because we can just drill that sentence structure over and over. Something like telling narratives probably doesn't work as well with the 5-minute model. But if you think about those skills where the way we see progress is by getting higher repetitions in of just doing it over and over and over again, then this 5-minute model really lends itself well to that. And so what you're doing in that session is focusing on either establishing the skill or pushing them up to the next level. So we can think about, our hierarchy of articulation therapy, where we go from phrases to sentence, or, isolation to syllables to words to phrases to sentences to conversation. So are we pushing them up, or are we kind of getting them established on that level that we're at and just getting our repetitions in? So the beauty of a 5-minute session then is you don't have to pull out a game. You don't have to get some elaborate activity out. It's only 5 minutes. So what I'll do is I'll sit down with the kid and I'll say, okay, we're going to drill our words, right? And so I will have flashcards, or I like to use the Articulation Station Hive app. Oh, I should have put that in the resources. We should link to that one.
Okay.
And I'll just swipe through the words and I'll say, okay, we're just going to hit as many as we can. And if they're doing really good, then I'll bump them up to the next level. Okay, now we're going to make phrases with the words, or now we're going to switch to a different R vowel, So we'll just see how many repetitions we can get in 5 minutes. And if I start to lose them, I go, okay, stand on one foot and do 10 more words. Now stand on the other foot and do 10 more words. So we're still just hitting the drills and getting as many repetitions in as possible. So I love this because it's less time on us. It's less time out of the classroom for them. We have fewer behaviors to manage because it's a short session. So we can usually get through 5 minutes before everybody falls apart. And so it's just a really nice way to run our sessions. And there's a lot of research showing that kids can actually make faster progress with this approach than doing 2 30-minute sessions a week. So, and I linked to, at the end of this on one of the slides, I linked to the research on the 5-minute sessions. So if you are needing that to show your administration why you're doing this, you have the links to those as well.
That's awesome. We appreciate that.
Yeah.
I want to ask some follow-up questions to this.
Yes.
Like, what Who is this appropriate for? Can you give some examples what type of caseload this is appropriate for? What type of setting this would work well with?
hmm Yeah, so I have used this with preschoolers. Works really well with them because you usually can't get them to attend for more than 5 minutes anyway, right? Without doing something very engaging. So I've used it with preschoolers for sure on both articulation and phonology and some grammar stuff. School age children for sure, it absolutely works well with. If you are in the school setting, you have access, if you are in the same school, for longer than a couple of hours, you have access to them multiple times. So being able to just jump over and, you know, throw in a 5 minute session here, a 5 minute session there is not that big of a deal. Now, if you are in private practice or if you're doing in home, obviously, then that's a little harder to do the 5 minute because they have to bring them to you or you have to visit them. But I have also heard of people using this model for those kinds of clients with a teletherapy approach. So maybe they come in once a month to the office and you do your session, like a big long one, and you establish some skills. But then every week they just pop on at their assigned time onto your Zoom call, and they do 2 5-minute sessions a week where it's just a check-in, having them drill a couple more to get that in their mind, and then sending them on their way. So there's, you can be creative with it. But I think if you go to the next slide, I've got some ideas of how to actually implement this.
Awesome.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so assuming you're in the school, these would be the recommendations. Now, obviously, if you're not, you can tweak this. But for the school, what I like to do is schedule a block of time to see my 5-minute kids. So last year I was at a school 1 day a week, and that was the only day that I was there. And so I did the 5-minute with just 1 day a week. They normally recommend 2 to 5 sessions a week, but I did them in 1 day. So I would have an hour at the beginning of my schedule and an hour at the end. And that was my block to see my 5-minute kids. So during that block of time, I would kind of map out the way I wanted to walk through the school of, the order of their classrooms. And I would come to this classroom and I'd say, I need Johnny. Johnny would come out just right outside the door. We're not going all the way back to the speech room because that's going to take more than 5 minutes. So we pull Johnny out right in the hall and I set a 5-minute timer and I say, okay, we're going to do this today. And like I said, we just roll through the words or the flashcards for 5 minutes. I challenge them to see how many reps they can get in 5 minutes. And so sometimes we'll use like a little clicker, like a sports counter, to see how many they get. We can get 70, 80 reps in 5 minutes if we keep going. And then when the timer goes off, I send that kiddo back to class. I might ask them to send out the next one if there's another kid in their class that I need. Or then I just go down to the next classroom. Whoever I need next, grab them, 5 minutes, send them back. And so most of these studies are recommending between 2 and 5 sessions, depending on how severe the impairment is. So our milder kids can get away with 2. So that's what I was doing in the school where I was only there 1 day a week, was 1 at the beginning of the day, 1 at the end of the day. And they were still making fabulous progress with that. But then if you've got a more severe kid, maybe you see them 5 minutes every day. And so you've got that 5 weekly sessions. But yeah, so that's kind of how I structure it. I'm sure there's other ways to do it. The one thing to note, though, is that if you have a child on an IEP, you are going to need to amend the IEP in order to implement that. You can't get a kid and only see them for 3 5-minute sessions, right? So that is one challenge of doing it in the schools. But if you can start with your students who maybe are getting close to dismissal and you want to use that as kind of a carryover program, or the students who aren't making progress with a different approach and you say, hey, I want to try this, and kind of as those IEPs come up, start to amend those.
That's helpful to know. What does it look like in the IEP? Like, how would you write this?
So what I have found is that every school writes their IEPs differently. So that's a challenge. The way I wrote it was, number of sessions weekly, and then the amount was 5 minutes for the timing. I've also seen some do it monthly, where you could say, we're going to do, 6 5-minute sessions monthly, and then you have the flexibility to move around where those are going to be. This does get complicated with Medicaid. So you can't bill Medicaid for a 5-minute session. You can bill for 10 minutes usually. But so your school might say, nope, we want it to be at least 10 minutes so we can get that billing code, which, we have to work within the parameters we're given. But you can check with your school to see how that might best be written to follow their guidelines.
Okay, that's really good to know. I wonder what the percentage of schools billing Medicaid actually is nowadays.
Yeah, I would be curious to see that too.
Yeah, I wonder. Maybe Asha has that information. Who knows?
Yeah.
Um, Great. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on.
Yeah, so that was the one I wanted to dig in the deepest because that's the one I get the most questions about. So the rest of these we're going to kind of touch on a little faster. But
Okay.
this one is the 3-to-1 service delivery model. So this is where you do 3 weeks of direct SLP services in a month, and then 1 week per month of what we call indirect SLP services. These are sometimes called consult minutes, and that's 1 week of that per month. So the idea is that you are directly seeing your clients for 3 weeks, and then you take a week off to do these quote unquote indirect services. And those could include, but are not limited to, classroom observation, teacher and caregiver collaboration, program planning, preparation of materials, progress notes, collaboration with and training of staff who work with the student. So there's lots of different ways that we can use this. And I think, again, we all have this superhero syndrome where we feel like we need to be on every week, but actually taking a step back to take this week off to see how the child is actually performing in the classroom, talk to those teachers, talk to those caregivers, send out emails and say, hey, he's doing really good on this R sound. Can you guys practice like this at home? Like that can really make a huge difference for a child because, like I said, we're not the only ones they see, right? If we can spend that time collaborating with everybody else, then they can do the carryover piece and they can help that child really make it meaningful in their everyday life, whereas we just can't because we don't spend that much time with them.
Mhm.
So this is a model, again, there's a slide at the end that has the link to the resources and the research behind this one and some information from Asha about this model, so that if you are going to your administration and saying, hey, I want to switch these kids to 5-minute sessions and I want to take a week off every month, and they're going, what? Then you have the research to say, this is why, this is what we're seeing, and this is how it could benefit our students.
Yeah, that's really helpful to have those resources. I think Kristen from Kiwi Speech introduced this model on the podcast a long time ago. And instead of the last week being indirect services, that was like the data collection week. So it was like 3 weeks of, you know, therapy, but you're not taking data. And then that 1 week you are taking data but it's getting that baseline without any prompting or whatnot to kind of skew that data.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting. I wonder how many SLPs are actually implementing this model right now.
Yeah, so that's another option. This, if you did it exactly like this, you would need to change IEPs. Again, you would have to go
Mhm.
in and specify, we're doing 3 weeks of direct and 1 week of indirect and add that into the IEP. So yeah, if you don't have the ability to change your schedule, you can do it that way where maybe you're still seeing them, but you're not doing the intervention, you're doing the data piece, which we're going to talk about that on the data
Mhm.
collection section too. Or maybe you're going into the classroom and pushing in for that last week so that you can see how they're doing in the classroom. Now, again, that gets complicated if you have to specify regular education versus special education setting, but there's ways to finagle within the parameters you're given to use this type of an approach.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really interesting. All right, so
Hey,
now let's
data.
touch on data. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so streamlining data collection. My big takeaway that I want you to take out of this is you do not need to take data on every single repetition that the child ever does. And I don't know what the percentage of SLPs are that are doing that, where you actually feel the need to take data on everything. I think those of us who are more data minded and we like that tend to lean more towards collecting more data. And those who are more the relational type tend to maybe take less. But the idea here is that if we are nose down in our data and collecting all this data on everything the child's doing, it's taking away from our ability to interact with the child and to do the therapy part. Not that we can't do both, because we do a lot, but it's going to be more effective. That therapy is going to be more effective if we are engaged in that therapy and not stopping to take notes. So everybody likes to take data differently. I'm not going to tell you one specific way. I am going to show you mine that I like. But if you can follow these 3 rules, then you're going to be able to streamline what you're doing in data and still do it your way. So my rules are, number one, touch it once. So if you are writing your data on a Post-it note during your session and then transferring that to your notebook after the session and then putting it into the computer a week later, you're touching it 3 times. And that is taking up more time than you need. So we want to strive for touching it once. It may not happen. We may have to collect it on paper because we're in the session and that's what we have, and then transfer it to computer at the end of the trimester or whatever it is. But whenever possible, try to collect your data right where you're going to need it. So that would be the first rule, is touch it once. The second rule then is to take full data less often and to use a rubric style data in between. So this is kind of like what you were talking about, Kiwi Speech was doing. Is what I recommend is 3 weeks, or if you're doing the 3 therapy weeks, it would be 2 weeks. But for most of your sessions, you are simply doing the therapy, you are engaging, you are helping them, you are boosting their skills, and you just use a 1 to 5 scale at the end of the session. You say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how independent was the child with this skill? Not every repetition, but just overall, they were at a 4. They did it most of the time, but they needed some prompting. Or they were at a 2. I had to prompt a ton and we kind of got some, but it was really hard, right? So you're just 1 through 5, how'd they do? And that's all the data you take for your therapy days, quote unquote. And then you have maybe once a month where you actually sit down and take that full data where you're tracking every repetition and you're getting your accurate percentage and you're marking down how many prompts they needed or what kind of resources you had to use to get them there, right? So that's the second rule, is to take your full data less often and focus on therapy during those other sessions. And then my last rule is to be able to see all your data at a glance, if possible. So for me, when I take my full data once a month, I put that all on one page so I can see where we stand with all of those goals. Because how many times have you gotten to the end of your reporting period and gone, oh, I forgot that student had that other goal and I didn't even hit it this time, right? Or I didn't take data and now I don't know what to put in the progress report. So if we can see it all at a glance, that's helpful as well. So if you go to the next slide, Benita, I think that's the data collection pages that I use. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, these are kind of blurry. I have this one that's on the left is the daily notes page. So this is what I use for my non-data days. So the days that are focused on therapy. So I will write the date of the session, and then I will write whatever goal we worked on, and I'll be specific. So S in isolation, or R in single words, or whatever language skill we're working on. And then I will just check 1 through 5. And there's the key you can see up there, demonstrated the skill, however independently, or how much prompting they needed. So I'll just give it a 1 through 5 rating. And then on these other lines, I might write a quick note like, oh, this, used the straw technique. That worked great. Or tried the exploding tea technique, did not work at all, right? And so just so that I remember next time, oh, don't try that one again, or, oh yeah, lean on that. And so then maybe if we work on a couple of goals this session, I'll fill out the next line for the other goals. But that gives me my numeric data, right? So if you need to put in a percentage, not all schools will allow this, but some schools will let you say, oh, it was a 4 out of 5, that's an 80%. So if you have to put some sort of data like in a billing system, that still gives you a number that you could use. And it lets you look at a glance. Are we making progress? Is the number going up? Is it going down? Are we all over the place? So that's my daily sheet. And then this sheet on the right-hand side of the screen is what I use to collect my full data. So I'll write the goals along the left-hand column, and then I'll write the date and then my specific data as I collect that.
Okay.
So I think I have the daily notes sheet for free on the Speech and Language Kids website, and I put that link at the end of the slides as well. So if you guys want to get that one, I'm pretty sure that one's up. I don't remember about this one. Actually, I think they might both be there.
Awesome. This will be super helpful for people who maybe are just starting out or like looking to revamp their data collection system. I was
Yeah.
going to ask, are there instances where, like with Medicaid billing, because I never did it in the schools, that you have to target a goal every single time or take data on a goal every single session?
The way that I have had to do it at the school districts that I've worked with, which again, I know it seems to be different everywhere, which it shouldn't, but
Yeah.
it is. The way that I have seen it is you just have to say what you worked on and give some sort of a progress marker. So this is sufficient for that. I
Okay.
have talked to some SLPs who do say they have to give more data or more information, but that seems to be kind of case by case.
Okay. Good to know. So let's talk about how to reduce planning time.
Yes. So, if you guys are new to me, I am a big fan of no prep therapy and I talk about it all the time. So, there is a ton of resources over on the Speech and Language Kids website as well about how to do this. But what I recommend is to do child led sessions with no prep activities. So, instead of going on Teachers Pay Teachers and buying all the fancy activities and setting up these special sensory bins and all of these different things that take time and energy for us to set up ahead of time, we switch to focusing on a child-led, no prep type of therapy. And for some people, they're like, yes, this is exactly what I want. And for some people, this feels very uncomfortable because they like having a plan. They like knowing what they're going to do. And this is not to say that you can never have a plan or never have a fun activity set up or, buy that Teachers Pay Teachers thing that you've been eyeing. But if we can try to switch some or most of our sessions to this approach of this no prep, child led, then we are going to free up time in our own schedule that maybe every once in a while we can spend time on setting up this fun thing that we want to do. But it's when we feel like we have to have a fancy activity, we have to have a new activity for every skill every time. That's when we start to feel that overwhelm. That's when we burn out. That's when we just don't enjoy this anymore. So, what does a child-led therapy session look like? So this for me, obviously it's going to depend on the age of the client and what they're interested in. But I like to have a selection of things that they can do, and they come in and pick one. And then I, in my brain, already know what skill I want to work on and what step of that skill they're on. And we just work on it while they're doing whatever it is they picked. So if they're little, I let them pick something to play with and we work on it through play because children learn through play. If they're older, maybe we're playing a game or maybe we're doing a craft or maybe we're walking outside or throwing a football back and forth, right? It doesn't have to be anything fancy. We can just have some things available and then let them pick. And then not only are we not having to prep the activity, but it's going to be more meaningful to the child because it's something that they picked. It's something that they're interested in. So the thing that makes this work is knowing how to break a skill down into a step-by-step plan so that we can scaffold it. So the example I always use is where questions. Let's say you need to teach a child to answer where questions. Well, if we look at how children naturally learn where questions, we know that the first where questions that a baby answers is, where's your nose? And they point to their nose, right? So if we have a child who cannot answer where questions to save their life, we can say, okay, let's start with where's your nose, right? And we don't have to baby them, but we can say where means place. And when you hear the word where, you're going to answer with a place. Where's your nose? I just want you to point. Where's your nose? There it is. Okay. So now you answered a where question. And we do some body parts. And then we say, okay, now let's do a where question where you're pointing, but not on yourself, on something outside of you. So that's a next step look, right? So we're scaffolding, we're using task analysis, however you want to call that, but you're graduating them up through these steps. So if you know where a child is in that step plan, then it doesn't matter what they pick to work on. You can ask them where's their nose through any activity, right? So you're thinking about how to scaffold them through a skill and then just working on it with whatever they wanted to do. Does that make sense, Vanita?
Yeah, it definitely does make sense. And I think that this is very different than I think what a lot of SLPs go into, like the school, thinking they need to do. It's like, oh, I need to pick a theme of the week and a book of the week and get a Teachers Pay Teachers activity that matches that theme. I don't know, maybe that was just me, but that was
Nope.
exactly what I was doing. especially with my group therapy or my groups.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's what, I don't know if most, but it feels like most of SLPs are doing, because that's kind of the way it was explained to us, or that's the way we saw it being done, or if nothing else, that's the way we see it being done on social media. And, you know, it's great that we have access to all of these different resources and all of these activities. But like I said, it's when we feel like we are locked into those, that we have to do this every week. We have to come up with a new book and a new activity, and we have to print off something for every skill that these children are working on. That's when we start to feel bogged down. So if you can switch a lot of your kids to this approach, then that gives you the freedom to say, okay, well, this approach is working for most of my kids, but Johnny over here, man, he really needs to work on this thing. And I'm going to have to break this down farther. I'm going to have to really hone in on this thing. So then maybe you go find the resource that specifically teaches that skill, because it's one that's, you know, kind of weird, but then you're not spending your time grabbing activities and prepping all this stuff for all of your clients. It's just Johnny and these couple of other kids who need something a little different, right? But if you're working on, say, speech sounds, well, if you've got articulation cards, or, you know, the articulation Station Hive app where it's got the flashcards in it, then this is a great thing to do for no prep therapy. So you can have the group come in and say, okay, you guys have to pick out a game, but you have to agree on what game we're going to work on together. Okay, well, now we're working on social skills too, which, let's be honest, they probably all need. And so we work together, we pick a game, we get it on the table, and then before each person's turn, they have to say their sounds, or maybe they're practicing their words while this person's taking a turn in the game, right? So you can be having everybody kind of working on their stuff while that game is happening. Or we're playing with toys and I'm modeling the speech sound and pointing it out and having them repeat me as it comes up during our play scenario, right? So speech sounds are a really great one to start with if this is new to you. And then we can kind of look at different ways to incorporate this with other skills as well.
I'm just thinking, as you're like talking, is it possible to do the 5-minute therapy sessions within a group setting? So like not even having to change the IEP, but let's say you have a 30-minute group session, you're taking each kid to the side for the 5 minutes, maybe, and this is probably better for older kids, but like while they're playing a game that they can do on their own, you're taking each one aside. You could get 6 kids, right? Technically in for 5 minutes each. Do you think that
Yeah.
could work?
Yeah. So what I like to call that is the stations approach. So
Okay.
what I'll do is have stations set up around the room, and they're not elaborate, right? They do take a little more prep than, you know, strictly no prep, but having like a set of blocks over here, and when, you know, or a tracing activity over here. So there's different activities set up. And then each child has a list of the words that they're working on. And what we do is or the skill, you know, if it's language, whatever, what we do is we pick what they can be successful at, right? So if they are working on the S sound, and they can't quite get it in words yet without my help, but they can do it in isolation, then they are saying the S sound in isolation over and over and over again at each of these stations. And so we might have to walk through and say, okay, this is what the stations are. At this one, you're going to stack blocks and say your sound every time you stack a block. At this one, you're going to trace these lines and you're going to hold your sound while you trace the line. So we might have to kind of guide them through what they're supposed to do. But if you have those activities be consistent for maybe several weeks, they start to understand that process. And then one of the stations is me. So I'm sitting at one station, and that's what I'm doing. I'm getting that 5 minutes where I'm not working on the thing they're successful at. I'm working on bumping them up to the next level or starting a new skill, right? So I'm saying, okay, well, now we're going to work on those S words, and I'm going to help prompt you and tell you when you got it right and when you got it wrong, because I don't want them to practice wrong at the other stations. And if I'm like, wow, you are doing great with that. Okay, at your next station, now you're going to be saying words. So then I'm kind of bumping them up. So yeah, that's a way you can do the 5-minute model within that group session, because you're giving them something else to do while they're waiting. And maybe they're not doing the best practice, but again, we're getting a lot of repetitions in that 5 minutes. So that kind of makes it worth the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and realistically, when you're doing group therapy, you're probably only getting 5 minutes of direct with each student anyways. I would be curious. I mean, you could take
Mhm.
data on how many trials you're getting with a kiddo within the group setting versus if you what did you say? What did you call it? Section?
Stations.
Stations. Okay.
Stations,
So
yeah.
versus doing stations within the group setting
Mhm.
and then having that data to kind of justify doing it that way. I feel like that's also
Absolutely.
more convenient than maybe running from classroom to classroom unless you had a lot of kids in the same class.
Yeah. Yeah. That the benefit there would be if you're just pulling them for 5, then they're not missing as much class time. But if that's the structure you already have, then yeah, just switch it over. And that's exactly what you're talking about with the data. That's exactly what I did when I was getting ready to switch a kid to a 5-minute session from a 30-minute. I would take data in the 30-minute and see how many reps we got. And then the next session, I would just work with them for indirect or work with them directly for 5 minutes and mark how many data points we got. And it was usually pretty consistent. And so then as I'm going to these IEP meetings and saying, hey, I'd like to reduce your child's minutes from 30 to 5, then I could say, this is the data I took on your child. We can get just as many repetitions in 5 minutes and he's going to miss less class time. So absolutely. I love doing internal, studies like that where I'm using my own kids.
I think that's a great point though. Like they're going to miss less class time because I know that a lot of parents like they want them to get the speech, but then it's like, well, can they not miss this class or this one? And it's
Yeah.
really hard with scheduling.
Yeah. Yeah. The other idea that I saw recently, and this was, I think it's Dr. Mary Beth Schmidt, maybe I can check on that afterwards, but she did a study a couple years back on language therapy and what was the best length of sessions for language therapy. And what she found for language was also that if we did shorter sessions more frequently, that was more effective than doing longer sessions or even longer sessions more frequently. So what her study showed was if we did shorter sessions more frequently or longer sessions less frequently, as in like once every 2 weeks, that those were the kids that made the fastest progress, not the kids that had 30 minutes 3 times a week. So I thought that was interesting. But when she was talking about that, she was also giving some examples of ways you could finagle the scheduling. And so she said, well, what if you do, you have a 30-minute session and the first 5 minutes of your session, you're going to drill grammar, right? So they're getting that short burst of grammar. Maybe they're working on past tense verbs. So you're just saying some past tense sentences over and over and over for 5 minutes. And then for the rest of your session, you work on narratives. Maybe you're telling narratives and you do that for the rest of your session. And then the next session you have that week, you're going to do 5 minutes of grammar again at the beginning, right? So we're doing low intensity, high frequency for the grammar. But then for the rest of your session, you're not hitting narratives again. You're going to hit something else that they need. So some other language skill. And you're not going to come back to narratives again for 2 weeks. So now you've got the high intensity, low frequency. So she was talking about ways that you can kind of mix and match what you're working on to use these different approaches without having to actually change your scheduling. But I love that she was finding the same results with language as we're seeing with the speech sounds too.
Yeah, no, that's really good to know. And I'm assuming that, do you know about the population that she was working with? What
That
age
was
range?
school-based. It was
Okay.
elementary school-based, maybe up through high school, but at least elementary school. I can find that link. I heard it on the SLP Nerdcast, so I know that they did an article on it recently.
Okay, awesome. That's really good to know. Cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on.
Yeah. So there is the free blog post has a lot of resources about what we just talked about and some videos. And then that free daily notes page is the data page that I showed you. So that's inside the free library that we've got over there. So those were those two. And then the next 2 slides are the 5-minute resources on the actual studies. Oh, here, stay here for just a sec. So if you look at that bottom one, I liked this one a lot. This is 5minutekids.com. They have a 5-minute speech program and they have resources and materials that you can use. But they did a study and they found that they had clients receiving 9 5-minute sessions per month. So that's less than 3 a week, right? For 5-minute sessions. And they were discharged from speech in 9.6 months. The kids that received 7 30-minute sessions per month, it took 18 months. So it took half the time to dismiss these kids who were getting just a couple of 5-minute sessions a month. Isn't that cool?
Yeah. I mean, it's like what's happening in all of that other time. I'm sure it's a lot of there's the rapport building piece, right? Like,
Yes.
how is that happening? I imagine you couldn't just pick up a new client and do the 5-minute sessions per month. I mean, I guess you could, but I would imagine initially those 5-minute sessions would be built like or spent on building rapport.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, the 30-minute sessions, which probably involved a lot of group therapy, like you
Hmm.
can see that they're just not getting as many drills done within that session.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the parts, or maybe it was a different study that Dr. Mary Beth Schmidt was talking about, that they looked at in a 30-minute session, how many minutes were actually spent on active learning of the language targets that they were working on. And I'm not even going to try to quote it because I can't remember, but I want to say it was like half the session
Wow.
was actually spent on directly on that. But then you think, okay, well, we're directly working on this skill, but there's 4 of them. So how many times did they actually get to even practice? Right. So yeah, like 5 minutes, if you're just hitting those reps. And then the one right before that, you can see this one said, this was a meta study of several different studies. And they found that 2 to 3 sessions per week with 70 or more trials was the most effective. So it wasn't about the time, it was about how many trials you could get in. And I have a video over on, I think on that website that I just gave you guys, of me doing it with my son, where I tracked, I was like, let's see how many we can get in 5 minutes, right? So I did a 5-minute video and I just clicked every time he tried. And we got, I think 70 or 75. So like right up
Okay.
there for 5 minutes, so if we can get a kid to keep trying, we can get those 70 reps in 5 minutes, send them back to class, not have to get out of game, not have to manage behavior, and we still get the same results.
This makes me think of another proposed therapy model that Nesh, the SLP entrepreneur or entrepreneurial SLP on Instagram, she recently posted about this. And I think it blew a lot of people's minds. I think this actually applied more to maybe private practice, but I could see this even being done in a school setting, but you'd have to have an SLPA working with you. So I think that a lot of people that do teletherapy tend to have, not a lot, but some people that tend to do teletherapy have an SLPA on site. So this might work for something like that. But basically, what she was describing is what doctors do. So doctors within
Oh,
an hour, they'll see like 4 or 5 patients, but they only spend, let's say it's 4 patients in an hour. They're spending 15 minutes each time directly with the client and the family. The other 15 minutes, the SLPA. So the SLPA would be doing the full 30 minutes. The SLP would come in for 15 minutes, and within that hour, they would see 4 different clients,
no, I absolutely love that.
right?
I think that makes so much sense because it comes back to what's the thing that only we can do? Well, only we can look at this kid, figure out what they're doing, and figure out what they need to move to the next level, right? That is what our training is. We have this massive toolkit of all these different strategies we could try. So, you think about, okay, kid comes in with an S, right? The SLPA is not going to know how to get them to make that S right. But if we come in and try 7 different strategies and we're like, oh, that one, okay, all the kid needs to do now is practice exactly that way for 70 more times, right? So the SLPA then could take over and say, okay, I can help you practice now that she showed me this technique. So that goes straight back to what's the part that only we can do. And it's that troubleshooting, it's that decision making, it's that figuring out what's going on. And then somebody else can take over the practice piece of it. So yeah, I actually really like that.
I know, right? I was like that. I mean, I don't know that anybody's doing it right now, but I thought it was super interesting, especially for private practice. And then back to the 5-minute sessions. How are you handling different goals? Like, are you doing one goal for the 5 minutes and the next time you're doing the different goal? How do you handle that?
Yeah, so I tend to write fewer goals for kids than I think a lot of SLPs. So if you are stuck in the camp of I have my receptive language goals and there's 7 benchmarks under that one, and I have my expressive language goal and there's 7 under that one, and I have my speech goal and there's 7 under that one, right? If you're in that camp, this is not going to work for you. So I tend to pare this back. But what I would do is, if we're working on speech sounds, all of my 5-minute sessions are hitting that one speech sound, and I'll get through that one before I work on the next one. Or if we're doing like a cycles type approach, maybe we're going to do cycles, 5-minute cycles, which is Cycles is not a 5-minute model, but you can modify. So modified cycles. Maybe we're going to hit this phonological process for 2 weeks, and then we're going to hit this one for 2 weeks. And then if we had language stuff, I would either have a separate 5 minutes or maybe tag them together. So maybe we do 5 minutes of speech, 5 minutes of language, or maybe we're doing the 5-minute sessions for speech, but then we're doing one language session a week where we're a little bit longer so that we could get into it more. So I would kind of play around with the scheduling on that if I had more than one thing to work on.
Okay. And then how does student attendance affect this model? Does it work better for that? Is it worse?
I think it depends on how flexible you are in terms of finding your kids. So when I have done my 5-minute, I like to do the monthly if I can. So I'll say, I'm going to get 6 sessions monthly. And so that, ideally I'll do 2 for 3 weeks and then do my indirect week. But if I miss them on one of those days because they weren't there, then I've still got enough time in my schedule in that month that I can make that up later. And, it's a lot easier to throw a 5-minute session in than to throw a 30-minute session in if they missed it. So that tends to help for that. I mean, if you're only at the school one day a week like I am, then that makes it a little more complicated. But the nice thing about 5 minutes is you can grab them on their way off the bus, right? So if so-and-so rides bus 30 and bus 30 is always the first one there and they've got an extra 20 minutes in the morning before all the other kids, then you can grab that kid off the bus and do their 5-minute session while they're hanging up their coat and backpack. And that didn't even really take any of your time out of your day because it's just 5 minutes in those in-between times. Or maybe they're all getting ready for lunch and, there's that like weird mad rush where everybody's grabbing lunch boxes and lining up and the teacher's trying to corral the chaos. That takes about 5 minutes, right? I can grab a kid during that time and then say, okay, let me help you get your lunchbox so that you can go to lunch too, right? So there's other ways that we can kind of stick them in there too.
Yeah. No, I think it definitely is if SLPs aren't doing this, gonna get them thinking about who this would be appropriate for. It's probably not a whole caseload approach, right?
Yeah.
But paring some of those down to 5
Yeah.
minutes. Do you feel like
What
it's hard to switch gears though? Like in between a 5-minute session versus a group versus,
I like it, but I also have ADHD. So novelty goes really well for my brain. So I
Okay.
like being able to switch between different kind of approaches. I think it would be exhausting to do 5 minutes all day long because you'd be
Yeah.
constantly changing between kids, right? So I kind of like having a block of 5-minute and then a block of longer sessions. So yeah, when I've been switching kids to this model, I tend to start with my RTI kids, if that's a thing that you do in your school. I know, again, some schools do this, some schools don't, but in our schools, we have those kids who aren't on an IEP. They've been identified as having some sort of challenge, but we're going to try some interventions first and see if they can be helped without going to the full IEP process. And so we call those our RTI kids. This is great for those kids because if you're doing 5-minute sessions and they're not making progress, then you go, we probably need to do that full evaluation and figure out what's going on with that particular child and see what would better fit their needs. So I usually start with my RTI kids because they're not on an IEP, so I don't have to revise the IEP. And then as IEPs come due, or if students meet their goals early and we have to do an IEP early, then I will start to look at, okay, is this a child who would benefit from switching to a different model? And if so, then we can kind of try that. And I always tell parents, I say, this is what I want to do. This is why I want to do it. This is the results that I've seen with other kids, or this is what the study says. I want to try this. If it doesn't work though, we can just have a quick phone IEP amendment. I can change this right back and we can go back to the old system. I'm going to be collecting really great data to figure out if it's working. And as soon as I see that it's not, you'll be the first one I let know and we'll switch back. And usually that's enough for parents to go, okay, sure, let's try, right? So if they know there's a fallback, we can come back. And then any kids that I have that are getting close to dismissal, I also switch to the 5-minute because that's really what they need, right? They need a check-in of somebody coming in and go, hey, remember, you have an R sound that sounds different than that one. Can you switch? And they're like, oh yeah. And so having that quick reminder for 5 minutes is really all they need. And then having that more frequently helps so that it's not just once a week that they're seeing me.
Yeah. No, I think it's really good, especially you giving examples of who could benefit from this. And then what about the 3-to-1 model?
Yeah, so that's the research that we've got there. So there's information from ASHA, including, so if you go to the section on cyclical scheduling on this page, then you can see kind of their information about that. There's a couple benefits here that ASHA has talked about. We're increasing the consultation with teachers and parents, which will improve the quality of services. It leads to better morale, improves the ability to integrate speech and language goals with classroom curriculum, and fewer service cancellations, since we've got that flexibility to make up sessions. And then also there was a study that showed fewer SLP vacancies, reduced litigation, and significant reductions in SLPs taking work home, which is what we all want, right? So this was all great research if you need to point your administration in the direction of this type of an approach.
Yeah, that's really good to know. I think a reset is good for anybody. So having that extra week to get caught up on things, I could see how that would lead to better morale and fewer litigations and just
Yeah.
more negative consequences overall.
Yeah. And if you think about it as this is not just you asking for a week off, right? Because that always feels yucky, but saying, no, this is actually a way that we can improve the outcome for these students and that they could make faster progress if we are less burned out, if we have time to collaborate with people, if we have time to send stuff home to parents so that they can be helping as well. So this is really about helping the students. Obviously, it's going to help us too. But when we're not being selfish by asking for this extra week, because these are all things that need to happen too. And right now, those things are happening on our own time instead of the time when we're in the classroom or in the school where we could be making better use of that.
Hmm. I wonder how this impacts anybody who's doing contracting, like 1099 contracting, and what their parameters are. If they could set up a contract this way, it'd be really interesting, I think, to get you, I, and Elise on Instagram Live or something to kind of talk about this. That would be really cool.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of ways that this could be done creatively and used to benefit kids, and I definitely had kids that I tried a 3-1 model and I was like, oh man, that week off really messed up our progress. And you particularly need it every week, right? So we can be flexible and say, hey, this kid, I'm going to see him every week, but these other kids, I think the 3-1 model makes more sense. So
awesome. Well, Carrie, this has been amazing and super helpful for anybody that's listening. They have a lot to think about, and it's exciting to kind of think, okay, like I don't have to do it this way. It doesn't have to be this hard. Like I can make these changes and hopefully it will help to reduce that workload. So if anybody wants to connect with you, where can they find you?
Yep. So my email address is Carrie, and that's CARRIE at speechandlanguagekids.com. You can visit me at speechandlanguagekids.com. We've got lots of free resources over there, lots of videos and explanations on stuff. And then it's Carrie Clark _SLP on Instagram. So we've got all kinds of resources. You can find me pretty much anywhere.
Can you kind of give a brief overview of like what's on the Speech and Language Kids website?
Yeah, for sure. So that's my blog where I started blogging about what was going on. And so there's a lot of step-by-step guides on the website. So, when I talk about how do we break down those skills into a step-by-step plan, I've broken out a ton of skills over on that website. So you'll find those where we walk you through the steps of how to teach a specific skill. There's also resources on different diagnoses and different therapy approaches. We have one about the 5-minute speech plan. So lots of those kinds of things. And then there's free resources and materials over there as well. And then that also has access to our hub, which is our membership area that has even more of those resources as well.
Amazing. Are they any particular topic? What are your main topics on there if people are interested?
Yeah. So we hit all kids stuff. We primarily hit the communication side of it. We have a little bit of resources on swallowing and feeding, but not a ton. We try to really focus in on that communication piece, but we go all the way up through high school. So birth to 18, all the different areas of communication. We go into speech, language, social, voice, fluency, all of that.
Oh, amazing. That's super helpful. So you have the data collection sheets, anything on like writing goals?
Yeah, we have a lot of resources on writing goals. That's one that comes up a lot. And when I teach this program as the 6-week program inside the hub, we have a whole module on writing goals, and especially how to select goals. Because I feel like that's a piece where, we get into this trap of, okay, well, the child is struggling, right? There's 70 different things that they need to work on. And so we feel like we have to write goals for all of them, and figuring out how to prioritize the skills that are going to be most effective, and then also link that to something functional, right? So we're not just teaching them sequencing for the sake of teaching sequencing. We are teaching them sequencing so that they can retell a past event and it makes sense because the events are in order, right? So we focus on how do we prioritize, and then how do we tie that to something functional that will actually improve the life of the child.
I love that. Amazing. Well, Carrie, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait for listeners to hear this one.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on.